We are back and we are joined once again by friend of the show, John Nichols, national affairs correspondent for The Nation, whose piece we'll be discussing today is entitled Dan Osbourne is Ready to Mount an Ever Bolder Campaign Against Our Billionaire-Dominated Politics. John, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
It's an honor to be with you.
Great to talk to you. Excited to talk to you about this news. I mean, it's relatively new, but Dan Osbourne is running again earlier this week. It was kind of official. A lot of folks, after he so overperformed both expectations and Kamala Harris in the state in 2024, anticipated that this was likely to happen. But you interviewed him for The Nation. Just speak a little bit about how this came to be and what this announcement kind of means for the midterms in 2026.
Well, Emma, you've probably got the most astute audience around, so I don't have to give them a lot of background on Dan Osbourne. But for anybody that's tuning in, Dan Osbourne is a mechanic and a steam fitter, a union leader who was at the Kellogg's plant out in Omaha and led a big strike out there. It was a vital strike at a critical time. Got a lot of national attention, and he really held his own through it. He was strong. He was on a lot of TV, a lot of media, and people said, "Hey, you know what? You ought to get into politics." Most people are wise enough to say no, but he was interested. His dad had been a Republican county commissioner, so he had a little bit of background. He knew his way around politics a little bit, and he decided to run. Ran in 2024, determined that the way to do it was as an independent populist, and particularly an economic populist. Got 47% of the vote for the U.S. Senate, which was incredible, running way ahead of the ticket, the national ticket in the state of Nebraska, but also significantly running ahead of other Democrats or other figures. Remember, Osbourne an independent, but running ahead of Democrats who were challenging Republican senators in other states. And that's sort of the critical thing. It's like the Democratic Party is always looking for ways to win. Progressives are looking for ways to win. And what Osbourne said is, look, I have to do this on my own. I've got to do this as a genuine independent. If I do, it can work, and I can deliver a progressive populist economic message. And lo and behold, it did. He did very, very well. And he anticipated the post-election analysis of a lot of Democrats, which is to say that he focused on economic issues. He listened to people. He went out into rural areas, urban areas, everywhere in the state, to 200 town meetings in direct contact. Had events I went to with him where he drew Trump backers and Bernie Sanders backers. And they did not agree. And he recognized that. He listened to them. He would dial down the tensions and often say, look, is there anything we can agree on? That maybe corporations are too powerful. And lo and behold, got a lot of connection. Obviously, he was ahead of the curve. And, I always thought that he would probably run again because he's smart. And you never run once. If you get close, you run again. Yeah. And so he's running again, just announced. And if anything, in talking to him, he's more populist than before. I mean, he's coming at it. And maybe that's because he's running against an incumbent Republican senator who is the son of a billionaire.
Yeah. And I want to get into his opponent in just a second, but there's so much that you talked about there that I think is really important to dive into. And we're going to draw a lot of parallels with Zohran Mamdani in New York because the anti-billionaire or the economically populist strain is, even though they're on opposite sides of the country, that's the thread that connects it. But the establishment Democrats would say that Osborne's success as an independent was more about, like, okay, he didn't talk about cultural issues and focused on class. But when Mamdani is successful in New York, he talked about the billionaires too, but he is going to be at the Pride parade with the trans flag, and that's more, that's appropriate politics for New York City and in that context. But they still seem to ignore the anti-billionaire thing being the tide that lifts all boats for candidates that are challenging Republicans. It's clearly so salient, and Osbourne almost preceded the Mamdani success in Nebraska in the fall.
Yeah. So here's the thing to understand, and you know this, Emma, your audience does as well. This is a great big country.
Yeah.
And we have states and regions that are very different from one another. And people are going to do their politics in different ways in different places. But there are certain core questions of the moment that are incredibly salient. And one of them is whether we're going to be an oligarchy.
Right.
And it's interesting, if we're going to tie things together here, here's an interesting way to tie them together. And I will tell you, having been around Mamdani and around Osbourne and around a ton of other candidates that we don't talk about enough, coming from all sorts of different perspectives in all sorts of different places. What I'll tell you is there is sort of a constant here, and that is Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders is enthusiastic about both of these things that are happening for different reasons, but for the same core concept. Remember, Bernie Sanders started his Fighting Oligarchy tour, not in New York or not in California, but in Omaha, Nebraska, right? And he went there, and the shock of it back in February, where a lot of Democrats in Washington were just completely clueless, had no idea how to respond to their defeats in the presidential race, in the congressional races, the kind of overwhelming arrival of Trump and Trumpism in Washington, really struggling with it. I think Americans were wondering, where's the opposition? What Sanders decided to do was go out to America, right, and see, well, are there people ready to push back? Where did he begin? He began in Omaha, Nebraska. And to his shock, he got more people than anybody expected. They had overflow crowds, and that was the beginning of everything we've talked about since with this Fighting Oligarchy moment. Well, the one person who probably wasn't surprised that Fighting Oligarchy got traction in Omaha was Dan Osbourne, because he had gone out across the state. And it's interesting because when you say that he doesn't focus a lot on cultural issues, Dan Osbourne is pro-choice. He is somebody.
I meant that's the narrative. I want to be clear.
I know you know that.
Yes,
but I want to emphasize one of the subtleties of the 2024 race in which Dan Osbourne did so well. The TV ads against him, because they got scared of him. He started rising fast, and they got scared. The TV ads against him ripped into him for being pro-choice, right? He was attacked on particularly some of these issues, right? So people in Nebraska knew at least something about the play, the broader play, and all these political issues. But what they heard, especially, was what he was saying about economics, what he was saying about the injustice of our economic system at this point. And so I think that one of the things that I've always tried to talk about in politics is volume strategies. What do you turn the volume up on? I mean, what can people hear above all the other discourse? And I can tell you, I've been in rooms in Nebraska, in union halls, in relatively smaller towns, where Dan Osbourne was up in front, not with a microphone even, just standing at a table with a crowd of people in the room. And there was disagreement. There were people who would step up and say, well, I disagree with you on this, or I like this, or I care about this. And what he would say is, yeah, you know what? In America, we're going to disagree, right? We're going to have some differences. But can we agree that multinational corporations defining our trade policy, defining our economic policy, defining how we deal with healthcare, defining how we deal with everything is maybe a bad idea? And the interesting thing that I've seen just on reporting on this is that an awful lot of people in those rooms, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, Trump backers and Sanders backers, said, at the end of the day, I am so frustrated. I'm so angry with where our politics is that I'm going to give you a chance, because you're a mechanic, you're a steam fitter, you're a union leader, you're not a career politician. You look a lot like me. You drove up in a pickup truck, and maybe sending somebody like you to the Senate won't solve all the problems. Maybe you won't even do all the things I'd want you to do, but perhaps you might open up our politics enough so that we've got an honest discourse in America. And I'll tell you one last thing. I'll just throw on there. I don't want to over talk this.
No.
But when I asked Dan Osbourne, what's the thing at core that you would change? It was really interesting, because he went right to Citizens United.
Yeah.
And he says, if we get the money out of politics, then we can have an honest debate. But until we do,
yeah, and I mean, there's so it creates a narrative, right? The Democrats have been missing a broad narrative that can cross the country in Nebraska or in New York City. And it's on a silver platter. It's here. It's the anti-billionaire. It's the oligarchy thing. But they won't take it. They won't seize it. And what's great about this narrative is it's not that the Democrats are good stewards of the system that people already think aren't working for them, and they'll be the right kind of bureaucrat that makes the machine that is making your life worse function better. Like, that's what the grand narrative has been. They're avoiding this, and they're taking it as like, oh, well, he avoided this issue that it doesn't poll test well, or he didn't go on. He was maybe a little bit more hawkish on the border than other Democrats, and like, let's move in that direction, as opposed to the obvious in your face, like, emphasis on one thing. Because here's the thing about polling is we see how like gun control polls across the country, 80%, 90%, other thing, even things like money in politics polls very well. It doesn't matter how something polls if people aren't going to the polls based on that issue. Trans issues, it's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. But something that people would go to the polls for would be somebody that says, I'm going to tax billionaires and make your life better by going after them. And it's right there. And there's so many national Democrats who refuse to recognize it.
It's totally true. It's kind of a nightmare. It's kind of like a surreal situation. Yes. And again, I will emphasize to you, Dan Osbourne is not a Democrat.
Right.
This is a big deal to understand. He is sort of a pox on both parties. He literally told me the other day that if he wins the seat, he's going to take a lawn chair, the kind you put up behind your place when you're having a barbecue. He's going to take a lawn chair out to Washington. And when they do the State of the Union, he's going to go and put that chair between the two parties, right?
As he should, because the Democratic brand is so toxic. That's the other thing he's smart about. And that's an unfortunate thing for us to realize. But in a state like Nebraska, he has a better chance as an independent than with the D next to his name.
Yeah. And you know who's recognized that? A guy who, many decades ago, looked at a very, very historically very Republican state that voted for George H.W. Bush in 1988 and decided to run for federal office as an independent and won ultimately, and then won a Senate seat. His name's Bernie Sanders, right? Yep. And so sometimes, now we think of Vermont as a very, very liberal state, a very democratic state. What we don't recognize is that it wasn't that long ago that it was a different state. And so sometimes you find your way in as an independent. Where you end up, well, that's an open question, right? And I'm not here to tell you what Dan Osbourne will ultimately do politically. That's have him on. He'd probably come on and love to talk to you.
We would love to. Yeah.
But what I will tell you is this: in talking to him a lot, I can tell you that he goes deeper than a lot of our political strategists and pollsters do. When I asked him about, kind of what are you looking for? What kind of coalition are you kind of trying to create? He went back to 1900, the early 1900s. And he said, there were populist movements in the 1890s, early 1900s that brought together folks who thought they were Democrats, thought they were Republicans, thought they were a lot of things, and said, look, in this post-Civil War era, right? Maybe we need to open up to understand that a lot's changing. We're moving into we're in an industrial revolution. There's a lot of stuff going on. Maybe the politics of the past isn't sufficient for where we're at. And so a lot of people in Nebraska actually supported that. Nebraska was once a very progressive populist state, sent George Norris to the Senate, et cetera. And so Osbourne is exploring this, and he really is, a working class guy. And that's part of his huge appeal. But another part of his appeal is he's thought long and hard. When you're driving across Nebraska, it's a long way. You're going out to western Nebraska, you're in that truck for a long time. You can either listen to the radio or whatever, or you can think. And I think that he has thought a lot about what that next politics is. And the truth of the matter is that a Republican Party of Donald Trump and Elon Musk is not going to be home to that next politics, right? They have chosen oligarchy. They've chosen the billionaire class.
Josh Hawley's just doing a performance with the populism thing. Osbourne recognizes there's no home for it in that party.
I think that's right. Although, look, even Hawley, you dislike him as you may, he's smart enough to recognize that it's not bad to talk about that.
Right. And I just like him writing that op-ed about Save Medicaid and then voting for the bill that destroys Medicaid. Like, I mean, I'm just sick of rehabilitating this asshole. But anyway, yeah.
But so what we can accept is there's not a place in the Republican Party for this.
Right.
But the question is whether there's a place in the Democratic Party for it. What Osbourne has determined is that people in Nebraska don't think so, right? Or they don't sufficiently. Now, there's Jane Cleave and other people who are out there, some really good folks are trying to rebuild the Democratic Party out there, and I give them credit for that, right? There's a lot of different entry points, a lot of people trying to come at this in different ways. But Osbourne is going to do an experiment, basically, and is going to say, look, is there a space for a next politics? And if there is, can you build a coalition sufficient to beat a member of one of the wealthiest families in America? A guy who literally engineered his own appointment to the Senate. That's Pete Ricketts. Can you beat this guy who literally has unlimited money, unlimited access to power, with a coalition of people who maybe don't even identify ideologically, but who are frustrated and upset with where America is headed? If he does that, very up for grabs, we don't know where this election will go, but if he pulls that off, then the message for the Democratic Party is there's some obvious North Stars out there that you ought to be looking at, right?
I mean, I wish they would. It seems obvious to everybody, but they're financially invested in in putting the blinders on, and that's, I guess, where I would love to kind of maybe wrap here with you, John, is just this. When you mentioned the Nebraska Democratic Party, it's a dance, right? Because Osbourne doesn't want to be associated with the brand of the Democratic Party because it would be bad for him electorally, and that makes total sense. But it occurs to me that it might not be as much of an albatross in 26 as it was in 2024, coming off the Biden administration and with the Harris campaign just being so feckless down the stretch, and the backlash to the explicitly pro-billionaire agenda of the Republicans might make it so that, like, they're going to run ads saying he's secretly a Democrat, the Democratic Party is working on his behalf, and, like, they want him to win. That's true. But maybe those attacks don't land in the same way they would have 2 years prior because of the conditions I'm describing.
You've laid a lot of important stuff out here, so let's do it. Let's go through it quickly. First, the Nebraska Democratic Party, which I've looked at pretty seriously as I do at these parties all over the country, is sort of in the forefront, trying to do it better. And I think they are some pretty creative people there, and led by their chair, and so I don't think it's about the Nebraska Democratic Party, right?
Right.
This is about the national party and the image of the national party and where that's headed. That's a complex issue, but we know that it has often been demonized in advertising, and there's all sorts of strategies related to that. Will it be different in 2026? Of course it will be different. Look at 2018, which was the first midterm of Trump's first term. People were shocked by how well Democrats did. They won governorships, they won Senate seats, they won House seats at sort of an amazing level. They actually stole the Trump agenda, in that midterm election. So yes, there was a shift. And will there be a similar shift in 2026? I think it is very possible. However, the one counsel I'll give you is, how big a shift is it, right? Is it sufficient to really kind of alter the direction? Now, we saw that in the spring in Wisconsin when we had the state Supreme Court race. And Elon Musk came in and tried to spend $25 million to flip the race to the Trump conservative candidate. The reaction against that was overwhelming. The total for the progressive candidate in that Supreme Court race went through the roof. Counties shifted all over the place. Now, that was a nonpartisan race. It wasn't Democrat versus Republican. It was a nonpartisan race. And so you had this sort of real-time evidence that, boy, if you've got an identity in the race of you're running against oligarchy You're running against the billionaire class, and somebody like Musk or even Trump makes that super clear. I think possibilities open up all over the place. But the last thing I'll leave you with is when Democrats kind of pull the brake on that, when they're overly cautious, when they're not too blunt because they may be flying out to someplace to have a dinner with donors the next day, right? They undermine the possibility. So you're absolutely right. 2026 is going to be different, but how different?
That's the question. That's the question. Yep, absolutely. John Nichols, I could talk to you about this for forever, but appreciate your time today. Everybody check out The Nation if you aren't already reading it. You must not like the show that much because we plug you guys all the time. Thanks so much, John. Really appreciate your time today.
Great honor to be with you, man. I love the work you're doing.
Thanks, and likewise.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.